I don't think it would be unfair of me to say that Fallout isn't exactly known for its incredible gameplay, mostly because it doesn't have incredible gameplay, or even particularly good gameplay. At its core, New Vegas's gameplay is, at best, mediocre, and at worst, a bit of a train wreck. Animations don't always play out as they should. Aiming is a bit finicky. Hit detection doesn't seem particularly accurate. Enemy AI is often more inept than a Disney executive. Even VATS is buggy as hell, and it basically exists, at least in modern Fallout games, as a means of bypassing the awkward gunplay. Sometimes the courier will just start rapidly firing all the remaining shots from VATS and miss every single one of them despite your chances of hitting the enemy having been 95%. With longer rifles and heavy weapons, enemies that are too close will basically become impossible to hit because of how VATS locks the player character onto the enemy models. Even the damage VATS tells you will be dealt with your shots isn't always accurate. And there isn't even a proper visual to account for standard damage versus potential critical hits either. This game's combat is a fucking mess, but that isn't exactly breaking news to anyone who's remotely familiar with these titles. So what exactly is it about New Vegas's gameplay that appeals to people as it does? Well, the answer is simple, but also kinda complicated. New Vegas boasts a wide variety of tertiary gameplay elements and scenarios to bolster the gameplay beyond the sum of its parts. When you're in combat, you're constantly taking into consideration the various skills you've invested in, the condition of your weapons, your action points, your limb condition and health, status conditions such as poison, buffs, and debuffs, and you're often going to have to consider the very same points regarding your enemies, at least in tighter encounters. Hardcore mode adds even more to consider, with healing being an overtime effect, stimpaks being unable to heal limbs, ammo having weight, and even more stats to manage, including sleep, hunger, and hydration. This is also why I recommend playing on hardcore mode by default, even for casual players, as the experience will be far more engaging than what's on offer in normal mode. If you're playing on hardcore mode and need to heal in the middle of a fight with a Deathclaw, your best method for achieving a successful heal is to either cripple its legs with the best single-fire or explosive weapon at your disposal, or stagger the Deathclaw into a ragdoll with either a riot shotgun, a powerful explosive, or a melee technique, of which there are plenty to find throughout any run, even for non-melee oriented characters. On normal mode, you can just kinda spam stimpaks for instant and massive bursts of healing, and to be clear, I'm not saying that you won't get an engaging experience on normal mode, but that hardcore mode has more for you to consider at any given time, and thus is far more engaging of an experience as a whole. But the variables that need to be taken into consideration by the player during the moment-to-moment gameplay don't just stop at the stats. Environmental factors are also a great way of maintaining player engagement beyond the combat, even in a game with relatively mediocre movement and traversal as New Vegas. The amount of areas, characters, and events that you can happen upon while exploring ensures that the player will always be contemplating what's around the next corner. What kind of loot does that building over there hold? What's the deal with this guy? Will this lead me into another quest that I've yet to discover, or will it pertain to a quest that I've started but yet to complete? Dead Money also did an excellent job of showing how the developers could work with a significantly more limited setting. Throughout the Sierra Madre are a number of hazards to take into consideration. Cloud pockets can either be avoided or charged through, but either choice could lead the courier into an unforeseen circumstance. Speakers need to either be disabled or ran past very quickly. Tripwires and grenade bouquets and pressure plates are also all over the place and can either be disabled, avoided, or even used against your enemies. And any of these hazards could be found in conjunction with one another. Players who take the time to explore are likely to come across an abundance of useful resources, but further exploration also means dealing with more of the Sierra Madre's relentlessly hostile environment, so players need to be considerate towards every potential give and take. Old World Blues also did a really good job of maintaining player engagement with its amusement park structure that streamlined the exploration to consistently indulge the player's curiosity. After all, this place is full of wondrous technology, and you might get some pretty damn good loot. All done? Cool beans. Why not go check out that place next? Rinse repeat. Lonesome Road, similarly to its story, feels like a culmination of all the tertiary modes of engagement explored in the base game and even prior DLCs. Level design with an emphasis on verticality, previously explored in Zion and the Big Empty, feels especially well crafted throughout the Divide. From Hopeville to Ashton, there are all different kinds of collapsed buildings and structures to ascend or descend while you engage with enemies. When staring down enemies from the high ground, you'll have the option to either take your shots from this advantageous position, attempt a flank, or even fall back into a hidden state, allowing you another chance to attempt stealth, provided the enemies don't have fast access to the player's position, as the marked ones are pretty damn aggressive, and not to mention perceptive. When dealing with enemies at a higher position than the player character, positions of cover and alternative paths are readily apparent, allowing for the player to decide for themselves how they would prefer to approach or escape the situation. But that's not all the player has to consider. There's also a number of warheads to be found throughout the Divide that can be triggered to create a sizable explosion that will blow enemies away, even on higher difficulties. Despite nukes being among Fallout's signature iconography and being so pivotal to the lore, the use of nukes throughout the games has been surprisingly tame, and it's interesting to see warheads turned into an actual game mechanic that not only allows for dealing massive damage to enemies, but also is used as a means of exploring the environment. And some of these are used pretty creatively too. In one case, an entire cave with a unique alpha deathclaw opens, with the entrance collapsing behind the player and only being destructible by detonating another warhead. Between the player and the deathclaw is a rocky structure for the player to hide behind, but in order to detonate the nuke safely, the player is going to need to come out of hiding in order to create the necessary distance between them and the nuke in order for them to survive. Since the laser detonator takes a bit of time in order to trigger each warhead, this means that the player, even with a stealth boy, would undoubtedly be exposing themselves to the deathclaw. In other cases, triggering a warhead can lead to a barrack filled with enemies, but also pretty valuable loot and even a commissary, or perhaps a small cave hosting a handful of goodies behind an enemy encampment. Detonating these warheads is required to progress, but doing so also alerts nearby enemies, and players that understand this can work stealth into the scenario, or just throw down with the enemies. Lonesome Road also makes use of something that I think is grossly underutilized in both the base game and other DLCs, and that's radiation. Canonically, it makes sense that very few areas in and around New Vegas would host much radiation, as Mr. House defended the city from incoming missiles during the Great War through his various security systems, but not long after the Great War, radioactive fallout swept through the Mojave through natural causes like wind and rain, and it was more than enough to kill the survivors in Las Vegas, so you'd think that there would be a bit more in terms of radioactivity, at least on the outskirts of the map, but that just doesn't seem to be the case. There are some radioactive hotspots and there is Camp Searchlight, but the amount of radioactive hotspots is noticeably sparse compared to games like Fallout 3. Dead Money opts to utilize the cloud instead of radiation, which makes sense given the lore of the Sierra Madre. Zion was pretty far out of the way as far as potential targets for nukes, and Big Mountain was one of the US government's most classified projects, so I can buy that information regarding it never made its way into the ears of enemy nations. There are explanations for the lack of radiation in New Vegas and its DLCs in the lore, yes, but you'd think that they'd have done a bit more with it given the title of the game. Lonesome Road, on the other hand, makes radiation a far bigger threat than any other part of New Vegas, barring perhaps Camp Searchlight. There are several locations throughout the Divide that will quickly fill that radiation meter, and detonating warheads means having to walk through another radioactive pocket, so the player needs to be swift and careful in how they navigate the Divide's more radioactive hotspots. Though I do feel compelled to point out that the radiation could have played an even bigger role in hardcore mode. In fact, I'd say it probably should have, but not as an environmental hazard. What I mean to say is that there is a bizarre amount of purified water throughout the Divide, which makes no sense whatsoever. Why on earth is a marked man, an enemy type described as being kept alive solely through the strength of the radiation, what in the fuck? Why on earth is a marked man, an enemy type described as being kept alive solely through the strength of the radiation that was also strong enough to flay their body in a location that recently had multiple nuclear warheads detonated beneath it, carrying purified water? Having only dirty water in the Divide would have greatly complemented the amount of radiation that exists in this area, because it would have added an extra wrinkle of complexity for hardcore players such as myself. If you're strained on supplies while simultaneously dehydrated and suffering from radiation sickness, having a drink of that water is a legitimately tough call to make, especially for newer players that have no idea how much longer they have left in the DLC, let alone how much more radiation, radaway, and sources of water that there are to even come across. I wouldn't consider this a huge knock against the DLC, if anything it is kind of a nitpick, and it only really becomes apparent in hardcore mode when you pay a lot of attention, but it also feels contradictory to the idea that this place was utterly scorched with radiation after having been nuked to Kingdom Fuck. Food is also a bit of an issue as well. Now, as far as standard food items go, Lonesome Road does a pretty good job. You'll find all kinds of snacks and the occasional Salisbury steak if you look around hard enough, but you're not going to find any fresh and clean-cut steaks lying around this hellscape. What you will find, however, are a few dozen meals ready to eat, or MREs for short. Here's a fun fact about your favorite YouTuber. Yours truly, of course. I went to military training for a while. Unfortunately, I was medically discharged, but I had a pretty good time while I was there. During my time in training, I had a couple of MREs, one that I had to eat cold due to circumstances that I'm not going to bore you with. I was an idiot is the answer, and one that was heated up proper. They were fine, not exactly a meal that you'd get on a cruise or out of Hell's Kitchen, but compared to the powdery slops of nutrition that we were typically being fed, it was a really nice change of pace. I would not, however, describe them as being able to resolve critical starvation. Now, don't get me wrong, your standard military MRE can be a nice pick-me-up, even with the stress of battle being taken into account, and the whole point of them is to keep a soldier from going hungry over a roughly 24-hour period, depending on the ration being consumed. But being able to bring you back from the brink of starving to death to only mildly hungry, I'm pretty comfortable in saying that, yeah, I don't think they're really that good. The fact that this thing cures more hunger than well-cooked Brahmin steaks is utterly baffling to me. Like, I know this is the future and all, but this isn't as simple as, well, of course a plasma rifle is going to be more advanced in 2077 than the M1911 or the M4 carbine in the early 2000s. Now, in fairness, MREs have had an ongoing development since about 1963, so I can buy that in 2077, especially with the world being enveloped in war, that the MRE would be pretty damn effective at curing one's hunger. But I'd also like a bit more to go on here, and there's no document in the game, that I'm aware of, that explains why these MREs are so fucking incredible. Now, you're probably thinking at this point, this guy's been on for a bit about military rations, like, what is the big deal? So, alright, maybe the specifics of the MRE aren't exactly critical to the plot of Lonesome Road, but it all goes back to the point that I was making about purified water, just from a different angle. Having an abundance of purified water in a place like the Divide makes about as much sense as having an abundance of female warriors in the Legion, or competent leaders in the NCR. Having MREs so potent that near-fatal starvation can be turned into mild hunger is gonna take a bit more than, well, they're MREs from the future. And the effect that this has on the gameplay is that it causes the management of hardcore stats to become a complete non-issue, despite this supposedly being one of the harshest environments in post-atomic North America. I'm a bit more generous to the base game and even the other expansions to an extent for having the potential to keep the player stocked up on every bit of food or water that they could ever ask for, because I've put nearly 3,000 hours into New Vegas since it dropped in 2010. I have an extreme understanding of where just about everything in the base game is, especially after the recent 7 playthroughs that I did for this DLC series. The Sierra Madre has the vending machines which can supply the player, but only if they're finding enough Sierra Madre chips, which I can because I know the villa inside and out, and the casino is full of loot, which makes sense given how well preserved that it is. Honest Hearts is generous on water with its clean rivers, but when it comes to food, it's up to you to keep yourself stocked, either by bringing in a ton of food with you to Zion, or by living off the land, which makes sense. Big Mountain isn't exactly overflowing with resources, but there's enough to carry you through the pretty short main quest. After which you can go right back to the Mojave and then come back whenever you like. Plus you could bring in as many items as you like to begin with, at which point it's on you to maintain your inventory. Lonesome Road isn't the longest DLC ever, and you can bring as much as you like, just like Honest Hearts and Old World Blues, but there's also a fair amount of very heavy loot to find in the Divide, even as early as Hopeville Silo. Now sure, you can leave and come back whenever you want, but even with a PC that loads fast travel within a matter of frames, frames, going back and forth would be pretty obnoxious after a while, given that you'd have to go all the way back to the canyon wreckage, step out, fast travel to whatever home base you're using for that character, drop off your items, fast travel back to the canyon wreckage, step in, then fast travel one more time to your most recent area. I imagine that most players aren't going to bother doing that, as it would basically be sabotaging your own pace of progression unless they are in a serious pickle, in which case I don't exactly blame them. So for the most part, players are going to find themselves edging their weight limit pretty frequently unless they just really feel like doing a lot of fast traveling, but at that point it's kind of on them. The excess weight of loot would complement a heavy tax on one's resources pretty well, but that's typically not going to be the case since the Divide is practically overflowing with MREs and purified water. Those of you who don't play on hardcore mode are probably thinking that I need to just shut the fuck up already, but even without it directly affecting the gameplay as it does in hardcore mode, you gotta admit, it's fucking weird seeing so much purified water in this atomic hellscape. I think we can agree on that much at least. It's not a world-building killer or anything, but it's pretty fucking jarring to say the least. The last hardcore stat is of course sleep, which Lonesome Road doesn't really play into, barring the inclusion of an item that lets you sleep anywhere, which I think is a great reward for players who've come this far. I will say that, in fairness, it's not like it would have made much sense to do much with sleep anyways, given the length of the DLC, like those before it, is only a handful of hours. Even for players completely getting turned around, none of these DLCs really go on for long enough that the player is going to be struggling to maintain their sleep, and there's plenty of beds throughout all of the expansions to keep the player healthy should they ever need them. I don't consider it a flaw that the main quests of these DLCs are fairly short. In fact, I think that Dead Money and Lonesome Road do an alright job in telling their stories with a succinct pacing, so it doesn't really feel right to criticize them for not being longer just because sleep isn't as big of a factor as it could be in this optional game mode. I guess the only thing that I really could say is that I appreciate the inclusion of the beds throughout these expansions, as they are generally well placed throughout the maps. In regards to Lonesome Road, you'll typically find at least one bed per area, so it's unlikely that you're going to feel strained on sleep in a way that feels unfair. But ultimately, that is the extent of it.
One thing I really appreciate about Lonesome Road, though, was the higher skill level requirements for just about everything in the Divide. When it comes to Ulysses, the one character you'll be conversing with, options beyond basic exposition typically require very high speech checks, some of which actually require high levels in medicine or survival. There is the occasional easy lockpick or hack, but most of them are actually set to hard or very hard, which requires levels of 75 to 100 respectively. Hacking or shutting down Ulysses' drones in the final battle, spoiler, requires 100 in repair or science. The reason I like this is because it makes the DLC feel like a proper culmination of not just the narrative with Ulysses, but also one of my courier, or couriers in my particular case with making these reviews. The game recommends being at least level 30 before tackling Lonesome Road, and it's really not hard to see why. It's also appropriate given that this is the last DLC that was released that so many skill checks would require mastery of said skills. Now sure, you could tackle this DLC before any other, hell you could walk straight to the Divide from Goodsprings at the very start of the game pretty easily too, but I imagine the great majority of people that will do this will be people who've already played the game at least once. I don't imagine very many new players are gonna beeline to this spot and proceed with it suggesting they be nearly 10 times their level. That would be a pretty odd decision, especially if they actually stuck it out. The first enemies you encounter are goddamn sentry bots. Though I suppose this is a good time to start talking about the enemies and the general combat of this DLC. Lonesome Road does not piss around when it comes to difficulty. The first enemies you fight are sentry bots, inarguably the toughest machine enemies barring special cases like the giant robo-rad scorpion. But what's even more terrifying to consider is that the encounters with sentry bots are among the easiest in this expansion. The marked men will be the most frequently encountered enemies here, but they aren't your typical raider reskins that you've likely come to expect after playing Honest Hearts and Old World Blues. No. These fuckers are mutated NCR and Legion soldiers with very high stats and a pretty varied but consistently powerful arsenal. Plasma casters, Gatling lasers, tri-beam laser rifles, anti-material snipers. There are even encounters with marked men using the signature weapons of this DLC, the rocket's red glare fully automatic rocket launcher, the flare gun, and the shoulder-mounted 10mm machine gun. Many of them even pack melee weapons including thermic lancers, bowie knives, fire axes, chainsaws, and even blades of the West, this DLC's variant of Legate Linnaeus's Blade of the East. Marked men also sport heavily degraded reskins of NCR and Legion armor, with a handful of unique enemies sporting metallic recreations of Legate Linnaeus's signature helm, which Ulysses will even comment on if you bring it up with him upon reaching the high road that precedes Ashton. Hell, some enemies even use stealth boys to try and catch you off guard. The marked men work so much better than the white legs or the lobotomites, because not only are they visually distinct, but there's a shit ton of variety in their weapons and gear, thus ensuring that every encounter feels like it requires a fair amount of focus from the player, lest they run the risk of getting caught off guard. Hell, even the placement of these enemies throughout the Divide has a clear purpose to them. Enemies at high ground have a strong overview of the terrain, so it's on the player to either try and engage with them from the low ground, or try to sneak around them to gain the advantage. Multiple ambushes occur not just along the main path, but also in areas that genuinely caught me off guard. I thought going into this building with a very hard lock on the door would just yield a bit of loot, but I nearly jumped out of my seat when I turned around and saw two marked men in the corners pouncing me. Well played, Obsidian. But it's not just the marked men and a couple of bots that litter the Divide. There are also Deathclaws. Anyone who's familiar with Fallout at this point knows the deal, and anyone who's played on very hard difficulty knows how genuinely terrifying these fucking things are. For those unaware, even my level 50 melee build, which had incredible defensive stats, was getting one-shot by these things, because their attacks completely ignore both armor and damage resistance. The first encounter with Deathclaws occurs on the high road leading to Ashton, and it's no joke. Across the highway, you'll likely see two Deathclaws roaming near a warhead. Setting off the warhead is unlikely to kill them, at least on higher difficulties, and especially if your character is a high level since enemies scale with you, but it can be a great way to get some solid damage in right out the gate. Unfortunately, that also means alerting them to your presence, and if you're not prepared to handle these two overgrown lizards charging you down, you're going to want to consider alternative approaches. Perhaps sniping from afar to cripple their limbs, or using a stealth boy or even stealth critical with a powerful explosive like the Fat Man. There's even a Deathclaw ambush at one point, though it doesn't always function. Alright, so the build up here is really damn solid. Just before the two Deathclaws is a small trailer with a lot of ammo in it. Oh boy, that's wonderful. Wait, what's that noise? That, my friends, is a Deathclaw on top of the trailer. Not really sure how it got there, but you are now trapped. Still undetected, but in extremely close proximity to this enemy that can kill you very quickly.
Fairly alarmed here.
At least, sometimes I was. Other times, well, I'm not sure if it's an issue with the AI or the Deathclaw character model, but I don't think this is normal. Well, it may be normal in New Vegas because it's a really glitchy game, but you get the idea. But as terrifying as Deathclaws usually are, the true terror of the Divide lies further in the depths. These creatures are known as tunnelers, and I have a fair bit to say about them. So the idea behind these enemies is that they come from underground and attack in swarms while also being pretty damn strong. They come in a total of 4 variants: the standard tunnelers, the venomous tunnelers who can poison the player, the hulking tunnelers, which move slower but hit really damn hard, and the tunneler queen, heavy hitting and quite fast. On paper, there's a healthy enough variety for this single enemy type, but things don't quite translate in practice. The issue for me is one of balancing. All variants of tunnelers are capable of killing a player very quickly, and their damage resistance is nothing to scoff at either. This causes the gameplay to feel very restricted regardless of the tunneler variant that's being encountered, because what separates them isn't even being given a chance to stand out. No matter what tunneler you're facing, the strategy is basically always going to be the same. Try and keep a distance while dishing out as much damage as possible, typically to their limbs, or just sneak by. This feels like a bit of a downgrade when compared to an enemy like the Ghost People. Now sure, the Ghost People weren't the most significantly varied bunch, but they did a great job at facilitating certain actions to be taken by the player upon being encountered, which would help to maintain a sort of structure to the combat which players could work out in their heads. If you saw a harvester or a seeker, you knew that you'd have to work around its throwing spears and potentially a gas bomb, and that if you did close the distance, you would then need to act very quickly in order to keep it from overwhelming you with its melee knife spear. If you saw a trapper, you knew that distance was vital as it could cripple your limbs very easily, and it moves pretty slowly, barring its relatively fast attack animations. However, you would also need to keep in mind the environment around you so as not to accidentally stumble into any traps or potentially a cloud pocket. Combine all of that with a focus on limb dismemberment, and what you end up with is an enemy that was easy to grasp, but pretty difficult to manage. So when scenarios would present themselves to the player could then begin to consider these differences between the Ghost People variants and work from there. Going back to what I said about New Vegas' combat earlier, even though the core combat is pretty weak, the tertiary elements help to keep the player engaged and active in their play. Tunnelers have basically identical attacks and behaviors, and given how quickly they can kill the player, nothing about stat differences or the inclusion of poison gets much of a chance to be taken into consideration beyond, the queen might one-shot me. And that's not exactly healthy for player engagement. They can go into these holes in the ground to come out somewhere else in the environment, but this feels more like an opportunity for the player to score some free damage or potentially heal or reload. Beyond that, they just swarm you and swipe for massive damage. It's painfully simple. Crippling their limbs doesn't even seem to do that much to slow them down or weaken their strikes either. What's really weird is how they don't take extra damage to the head, which is fucking bizarre to me given how sensitive their senses supposedly are to external factors such as light. The game provides the player with tools like the flashbang and flare gun to scare off the tunnelers because the idea is that they evolved deep underground, so light can really throw off their senses, and that's pretty cool. I like it as a mechanic, even if the AI doesn't always seem to respond to these weapons properly. So why do their heads seem to be insanely resistant to damage? Wouldn't headshots, especially from explosives, completely discombobulate them? I will say I like their visual design, even if the only difference I can really find between the four variants is the size of the models, and they're pretty damn interesting as far as the lore of the Divide goes, but mechanically speaking, the tunnelers are more than a little lacking, and in one particular case are fucking dreadful to deal with. I'm talking, of course, about none other than the set piece which follows the courier's arrival to the Ashton missile silo. After triggering a missile over the Divide, the player makes their way into the silo where they take this sort of elevator down to the bottommost floor while explosions go off left and right and tunnelers swarm the platform. This felt so goddamn stupid that I audibly groaned when I first played through it. The issue here is that this set piece leans completely on the core combat in a way that does not complement the mechanics which the combat is built upon. You can have all kinds of different combat scenarios, even with New Vegas' gameplay, but shoving a player into a small area being swarmed with enemies that not only hit really hard, but are faster than the player is not the kind of combat scenario that works with these systems. Since the enemies move faster than the player is forced to try and dish out as much damage as possible the moment enemies spawn in. However, the player can't do much until the tunnelers are on the platform, at which point the player will need to kill them with extreme speed just so they can survive. This essentially acts as a stress test of New Vegas' gameplay, as well as a sort of DPS race, which makes it incredibly frustrating when any one of the various issues that I mentioned at the start of the video rears its ugly head. Having trouble aiming because acceleration is non-existent, bad hit detection, awkward model animations, all of that makes this whole set piece plenty annoying as is, but combine it with the constant explosions that mess with the camera, obscuring the player's vision and making it impossible to tell where your bullets are actually going to travel, and what you ultimately end up with is a section that's only remotely tolerable on lower difficulties. This set piece is also extremely unfriendly to any build that doesn't have a massive amount of straightforward damage burst. Stealth isn't an option, explosive builds will frequently cripple your own limbs, snipers struggle to work at such a close range, melee players are alright, on lower difficulties, but in the end if you're not rocking a riot shotgun, this set piece is a fucking nightmare to get through, and I genuinely would love to see a mod that just deletes it entirely. Beyond this set piece though, I do feel like it's important for me to acknowledge just how build-friendly this DLC generally is. There's a lot of fun to be had in the Divide for all different kinds of couriers. Now granted, if you're even close to level 50, it's unlikely you won't be able to use basically whatever weapon you want, but for those couriers not quite that high leveled or even just willingly dedicating to any single build, there is plenty to work with here. Guns and energy weapons both get plenty of support here, with ammo for both being fairly common, which is nice given how tanky enemies can be,
and all kinds of weapons to pick up, from anti-material rifles to heavy plasma casters. Melee builds would seem to struggle a bit more than others, though it's worth noting that every enemy in the Divide is capable of being knocked off their feet, barring the final boss, because he's the final boss. Hey, I don't make the rules, okay? Explosive builds have the rocket's Red Glare fully automatic rocket launcher, which is pretty damn powerful, although it admittedly struggles a bit on the higher difficulty settings. But hey, who cares when you can just nuke the fuckers into oblivion anyways using a Fat Man? Stealth builds are also in for a treat, because although stealth is still quite powerful, Lonesome Road seems to have a really solid grasp as to how the stealth gameplay works, and is designed in ways that establish a pretty solid challenge for stealth players unlike the other 80% of the game. Dead Money does alright though. In New Vegas, stealth is very much intended to be a high-risk, high-reward playstyle. You build your courier to be fairly fragile, but capable of dealing extremely high damage for stealth criticals, which do seem to be much stronger than standard critical hits. The reason that most of New Vegas doesn't really do well to handle this kind of build is primarily due to the fact that the player just has so many options for taking out their enemies. In more cramped areas, players can utilize melee or silenced weapons so as not to attract attention. They can opt not to engage with the enemy at all, or they can put live grenades into the pockets of enemies to take them out instantly regardless of how much health or damage resistance they have. You don't even need a high explosive skill level, it's just an insta-kill by default. In more open areas, you can typically dispatch enemies that are so far away that other enemies simply won't detect you. And even if you are finally detected by an enemy, you're rarely going to struggle to dispatch them as long as you have a decent critical hit rate, which you typically will, especially if you have perks like Finesse. It also doesn't really help that stealth can utterly shatter the enemy's AI. Like, seriously, being able to just sit in front of an enemy in plain sight without being seen is something to behold. I don't think I'd be wrong in saying that stealth is by far the best build in New Vegas, at least to my knowledge. The drawbacks are quite minimal, damage output is high, you typically aren't in any kind of danger since enemies aren't aware of you most of the time, and you have a number of options to fall back on in the event that an enemy even manages to detect you in the first place. Plus, you can opt for any kind of weapon style, from melee to standard firearms to energy weapons to even explosives, and there are perks that benefit these subcategories of stealth builds. In Lonesome Road, however, enemies are highly perceptive, so unless you've got a stealth boy, you're really going to want to stay out of sight, which isn't always easy given the enemy patrols that cover wide ground. The high damage output of these enemies reinforces the idea that stealth builds are glass cannons. High enemy health and damage resistance prioritizes sneak crits, ambushes challenge the player's ability to act on their feet while attempting stealth rather than approaching a scenario with the freedom to analyze the situation from a safe distance, radiation pushes the player to keep from hiding in certain spots for too long, exploding warheads means the player needs to be extremely cognizant of their surroundings if they want to proceed undetected and without engaging in combat. But it doesn't work entirely against the player either, barring the shitty Ashton missile silo set piece, which is a slap in the face to any build not properly dealing massive damage at short range. The player has a lot of ground to take advantage of as a sniper, lots of potential cover on the low ground, and plenty of distance to work with should enemies become aware of them for any reason. So Lonesome Road does a pretty great job at complementing just about any build the player could be working with, especially this late in the game. On the flip side though is the crafting mechanic, which has been all but completely absent since Dead Money. Honest Hearts gave about as half-assed an effort as possible by saying, hey, you can live off the land in Zion, and the only crafting areas you'll find in the Big Empty are in the sink, which you typically won't even need to visit, barring the retrieval of the AI in the side quest. There are a couple of stations for crafting, reloading, and cooking to be found throughout the Divide, but they're about as useful as a rebreather in the Sierra Madre. Given that you can go into this DLC with however much gear you want, the fact that you can leave whenever you want, and the sheer abundance of resources if you can be bothered to explore any given area for all of a minute, the idea of taking the time to go craft in Lonesome Road isn't exactly an exciting one, and that's kind of a letdown. You'd think that crafting in a post-nuclear setting would be pretty damn useful to indulge in, but really it's just an additional and unnecessary addition that accomplishes very little that can't be done using more convenient mechanics. Need more ammo? Just go buy some. Can't afford it? Just go gamble. Low luck? Sell the gold bars of the Sierra Madre instead. Didn't get them? Farm some loot, or maybe steal something. Need food? Just stop by the Ultralux. Can't afford it? Go to Zion and hunt some Yaoguai. Too hard? Get good. All of that is much more engaging for the player to indulge in than just wandering around and looking for miscellaneous items listed on some crafting recipes. There's just no real reason to resort to crafting or cooking, and there's not much in the ways of appeal given how tedious picking up these miscellaneous resources can feel. This kind of issue isn't as frustrating as something more intrusive and in your face like the Ashton missile silo set piece, but it's still disappointing in its own way. Not a deal breaker by any means, just a bit lame in retrospect. I suppose the last thing worth bringing up would have to be Edie, or Eddie, which, he's kind of forgettable. I'll hold off on the story details for now, but as far as mechanics go, Edie doesn't really bring much to the table aside from being an occasional distraction and damage sponge for enemies. Aside from that, he won't really be doing much else given his weak damage output and slow rate of attack. At one point in the DLC, he's taken from the player, but his absence doesn't really do anything to increase the tension given how little of an impact that he's had on the general combat. The biggest issue for me really is the fact that Eddie can't even be destroyed while playing hardcore mode, since he is an essential NPC. This feels like a major missed opportunity. Jumping ahead in the story, the courier bringing Eddie to Ulysses' temple is an essential part of Ulysses' plan to
burn away the flags. Begin again.
And having a potential exclusive to hardcore mode of Eddie not arriving at the temple could have made for an interesting branching path that not many people would have known about. Within Eddie is a piece of technology that Ulysses needs, so if Eddie was destroyed, the player could potentially still bring that part, loot it off of Eddie to Ulysses, at which point he would scold the player for their inability to let go. If the player chose not to, then Ulysses' plan would be foiled and he'd have to fight the courier in order to go back into the divide to retrieve the part. Or perhaps the player would be able to convince him to stop by showing how they let go willingly of a piece of their past, and Ulysses could too. As for how Ulysses would communicate with the courier, maybe he'd just send another iBot. After all, he can basically produce however many he wants. This isn't an egregious problem, but it does feel like something of a missed opportunity. Though with that said, I can absolutely give Lonesome Road a thumbs up in regards to the gameplay. It certainly has its problems, but overall it does a lot more than either Honest Hearts or Old World Blues to facilitate and maintain player engagement. The loot is great. The enemy set is strong and decently varied. The exploration was satisfying. It's about as build-friendly as Dead Money, the warheads were a pretty strong mechanic, and some of the scenarios were genuinely very tense and challenging. I don't think it reaches the heights of Dead Money, but it definitely comes close in various aspects, and I would even say exceeds it in some cases. And wowzers, would you look at the time. It's kind of fascinating how there's so much to say regarding gameplay in these linear expansions versus the open worlds of Zion and Big Mountain. That's not even to suggest the gameplay of Old World Blues is bad, barring the ridiculous enemy health, but just to say that there's so much to analyze and dissect in these handcrafted levels and encounters versus the more basic, hey, sometimes you'll run into enemies. Or maybe it's not even an issue of linear versus open world. Plenty of more open world games have fantastically crafted levels and encounters, like Assassin's Creed Origins, The Witcher 3, Horizon, Legend of Zelda, and so on. Maybe the issue is that Obsidian put all their eggs into certain baskets. Maybe it's an issue of time. After all, Dead Money had a bit of work done prior to the release of New Vegas, and Lonesome Road came out not only last, but after multiple delays. Who's to really say? I suppose that in the end it doesn't really matter, but it is interesting to think about. Thank you all once again for supporting my content. The next part of this series will be a deep dive into the lore of the Divide and the story leading up to Ulysses' Temple, which we'll be covering in its own video afterwards, following which will be the conclusion. It's been a hell of a road so far, but we've got a lot more ground to cover. I'll see you all there. Take care, friends.